Welcome to the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act training program. This course provides you with information about the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. This course will cover the following topics: Module 1, Compliance Requirements; Module 2, Information and Communication Standards; Module 3, Employment Standards; Module 4, Transportation Standards; Module 5, Design of Public Spaces Standards; Module 6, Customer Service Standards. At the conclusion of the training course, you will be able to recognize your rights and responsibilities under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, 2005 AODA, became law on June 13, 2005. Under this landmark legislation, the Government of Ontario developed mandatory accessibility standards that organizations must follow to become more accessible. The goal for the province is to be fully accessible by 2025. All levels of government, private sectors, and non-profits must comply. The purpose of the AODA is to develop, implement, and enforce accessibility standards so that all Ontarians will benefit from accessible services, programs, and employment. During this course, many terms will be discussed. Here we explain some important terms defined under the AODA. Barrier: anything that prevents a person with a disability from fully participating in all aspects of society because of his or her disability. Disability: under AODA, disability includes a range of conditions, some of which are visible and some of which are not visible. Conditions may have been present from birth, have been caused by an accident, or have developed over time. Disabilities include visual, hearing, physical, intellectual, learning, and mental health disabilities. Organization: any organization in the public or private sector. Large organization: 50 or more employees. Small organization: 1 to 49 employees. Redeveloped: planned significant alterations to public spaces but does not include maintenance activities, environmental mitigation, or environmental restoration. Service animal: an identifiable working animal typically wearing a vest or harness that assists a person with a disability. Support person: someone who accompanies a person with a disability to help with communication, mobility, personal care, medical needs, or access to goods, services, or facilities. AODA training gives employees basic knowledge about accessibility and how it impacts people with disabilities. We often think of disabilities as either physical or visible. However, AODA includes all disabilities: physical, visible, and invisible disabilities, such as learning and mental health disabilities. Ontario businesses must follow the Ontario Regulation 191 Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, IASR, to prevent and remove barriers for people with disabilities. In 2016, the 5 standards of the AODA were consolidated under the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, or IASR. The 5 standards are Information and Communication, Employment, Transportation, Design of Public Spaces, and Customer Service. The Information and Communication Standard outlines requirements for organizations to create, provide, and receive information and communications that are accessible for people with disabilities. The employment standard requires that employers must make their workplace and employment practices accessible to potential or current employees with disabilities. The Transportation Standard sets out the requirements for transportation service providers. Particularly, features and equipment on vehicles, routes, and services offered must be accessible to people with disabilities. The Design of Public Spaces Standard outlines the need for newly constructed or redeveloped public spaces to be accessible for people with disabilities. The Customer Service Standard outlines requirements for removing barriers so that people with disabilities can access goods, services, and/or facilities. Ontarians with disabilities represent a growing market that the province cannot afford to miss out on. The population of Ontarians who have disabilities is steadily growing. Accessible information and employment will make it possible for this growing group of working-aged people to contribute to the economy and society in a meaningful way. Accessible transportation and public spaces will ensure that people can move around their communities, work outside their homes, and access goods and services. Customer service that accommodates people's individual needs will allow them to exercise their spending power. When combined with an aging population, people with disabilities will make up an estimated $536 billion of total income for Canada. People with disabilities are overlooked when it comes to workplace employment. Despite the stereotypes and barriers, there are plenty of benefits and reasons to hire people with disabilities. AODA assists both people with disabilities and employers to ensure that people living with impairments have equal opportunity and utilize their skills in the workplace. Becoming an inclusive workplace promotes diversity, productivity, reduced absenteeism, increased talent, and profitability. In turn, with an inclusive workplace, your business's brand and reputation will improve. Customer loyalty will increase when clients see a diverse and accessible work environment. The bottom line is that a more accessible Ontario is good for both the economy and the community. The application of AODA standards at the earliest time will help meet those projected economic growths by 2025. Module 1. Compliance Requirements. Module 1 is about the AODA compliance requirements. After this module, you will be able to explain AODA compliance requirements, while each of the 5 IASR standards has its own specific requirements, there are also general requirements that apply to all of the standards. These include training, an accessibility policy, and an accessibility plan. AODA training gives employees basic knowledge about accessibility and how it impacts people with disabilities. AODA training is required if you are a paid worker, a volunteer, or a new worker. You need to take AODA training if you provide goods, services, or facilities on behalf of your organization, develop an organization's policies, for example, a board member, make changes to your organization's accessibility policies, are an existing worker, and start a new position. All organizations have to keep track of their workers' training records, which must include the name of the worker and date of completion. An accessibility policy guides an organization's practices for providing goods, services, and facilities to people with disabilities. It also helps an organization achieve its accessibility goals. All large private and non-profit organizations and all public sector organizations have an accessibility policy in writing. These sectors must also make their policies available to the public. An accessibility plan works with the policy. That plan outlines what steps an organization will take to prevent and remove barriers to employment, and when it will do so. Organizations must also publish annual status reports. In addition, they must review and update their plans at least every 5 years. In this module, you learned the compliance requirements your business must meet. You learned that all workers, paid and unpaid, require AODA training. You also learned that large private and non-profit organizations, as well as public sector organizations, require an accessibility policy and plan. Module 2. Information and Communication Standards. Earlier in this course, you learned that the 5 AODA accessibility standards fall under the IASR. This module covers the Information and Communication Standards. Module 2 is about Information and Communication Standards. After this module, you will be able to identify the communication factors organizations need to know in order to provide employees and customers with accessible information and communication. The accessibility standard for information and communication requires businesses and organizations to provide and communicate information in ways that works for all employees and customers. This means that organizations must let the public know if they have information available in accessible formats. For instance, restaurants with Braille menus or performance venues with American Sign Language, ASL, interpreted performance dates must advertise the availability of these services so that customers who need them will be aware. Moreover, organizations must also make workers and the public aware that they will provide information in accessible formats and make communication supports available upon request. Some of the communication factors you need to consider are websites and web contents, formats and communication supports, emergency information, education materials and training resources, educators, public library materials and resources. By January 1, 2021, all Internet, websites, and web content must comply with the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.0 Level AA. These guidelines make websites more accessible for people who must use computers differently because of their disabilities. People must be able to navigate websites using technologies that make browsing possible without certain actions, such as looking at the screen or clicking a mouse. These technologies include speech recognition software, screen reader software, and screen magnification software. Organizations need to create and provide free accessible formats and communication supports to customers with disabilities. One example of an accessible format is the dual availability of printed and digital text formats when disseminating important information. For instance, a clinic handing out pamphlets with printed information on its various programs must also have the same information freely available in an alternative digital text-only format accessible by screen reading software on computers or tablets for persons with vision impairments or learning disabilities that affect reading. Examples of accessible formats are HTML or Microsoft Word, Braille, large print, audio, described video, text transcripts of visual or audio information, reading information aloud. Examples of communication supports are writing, email, or texting, captions, sign language interpretation, video relay service, assistive listening systems, augmentative and alternative communication devices such as letter, word, or picture boards, rephrasing information or restating it in clear language. Accessible formats and communication supports must be provided in a timely manner when requested. Organizations should work with the person requesting the information to find out what format will work best for them. If it is not technically possible to convert information into an accessible format, the organization producing it must explain why and provide a summary of the information. Also, organizations cannot charge more for accessible formats or communication supports than the regular cost of the original format. This standard also applies to customer feedback systems. In order to put the lessons you learned from your customers to good use, you can incorporate them into existing policies and processes to make other types of feedback systems accessible. One example is by going beyond handwritten surveys and putting in place processes that receive online and telephone feedback. If you don't receive and respond to feedback about other topics, you are not required to start doing so. You must ensure that your workers are informed about how to be safe at work. This includes providing workers with accessible public emergency information. A good example is an emergency safety brochure distributed throughout a university campus with several copies in large fonts or plain text files available upon request. School boards must provide accessibility awareness training to educators. Educators may be strictly defined as those who design courses, prepare and/or deliver lessons, are staff of school boards. However, best practice suggests that educators also include early childhood educators, educational assistants, child and youth workers, support staff, administrative staff. Best practice classifies the above workers as educators because they all encounter students with disabilities over the course of their general work. The training will help educators identify and meet the needs of students with different types of disabilities. It will also help them correct any barriers in the classroom, such as narrow aisles or pathways that have physical obstacles, lack of technology and other resources such as speech recognition software or Braille books. Training will also help educators become familiar with the various techniques that improve the learning environment for students with disabilities and the different types of learning resources and materials to use when developing lesson plans. Accessible lessons are lessons designed with all learners in mind. Training needs to incorporate teaching and training strategies for students with various disabilities, including visual, hearing, and mobility impairments, as well as learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and mental health challenges. Schools are required to provide course and program information, educational materials, training resources, and student records in accessible formats to ensure that all students with disabilities get the information they need. You may also be required to use in-house or external contractors to convert texts and images to accessible formats. Additionally, you'll need to work closely with individuals with disabilities to find out which format best suits their needs and meet them accordingly. All public libraries must provide alternative accessible formats wherever possible of all new and old library materials, such as literary, musical, artistic, and dramatic works. Let the public know about the availability of these materials in your library. When your library procures new materials, consider the variety of accessibility needs of your users. Libraries of educational or training institutions must provide, procure, or acquire accessible formats of print, digital, or multimedia resources for people with disabilities upon request. However, special collections, archive materials, rare books, and donations are exempt. In this module, you learned 6 different communication factors that organizations must consider. You learned the various examples of accessible formats and communication supports. You also learn the responsibilities of school boards and libraries and the requirements they must follow. Module 3. Employment Standards. This module covers the employment standards. By the end of this module, you will be able to recognize requirements for recruiting, hiring, and career development, list what is included in an individual accommodation plan, identify the elements included in a workplace personalized emergency response plan, identify what is included in a return-to-work process. The Accessibility Standard for Employment requires businesses and organizations to make accessibility a normal part of the recruitment process. In order to comply with the standard when recruiting, notify applicants about the availability of accommodation. Advertise on your website or on job postings that you welcome and encourage applications from people with disabilities. State that accommodations are available. If a selected applicant makes an accommodation request, the standard states that you must consult with the applicant to provide the accommodation. Remember, candidates with disabilities will best know what accommodations are suitable for them. When you do make an offer of employment, you must notify the successful applicant of your workplace's policies for accommodating employees with disabilities. Be sure to specify whom the applicant should contact if they wish to request an accommodation. Encourage the applicant to make any request as soon as possible. This way, you are able to implement the appropriate accommodations prior to the applicant's employment start date. Accommodations may involve the ways in which an employee with a disability receives and processes information, including all information integral to the employee's work and all information available to other employees in the workplace, like newsletters or bulletins. In addition, employers must alert all workers whenever there is a significant change to workplace policy on accommodation. Employers must also ensure that their career development processes are accessible. When workers with disabilities are promoted, are transferred to new positions, or receive performance reviews, they must be accommodated as they learn new job tasks or the responsibilities of new positions. Employees should have access to documents, coaching, and feedback in the format that works best for them. Large companies need to develop and document individual accommodation plans for employees with disabilities based on a clearly written process. The process should include how an employee requesting accommodation can participate in developing the plan, how the employee will be assessed on an individual basis, how the employee can request that a representative from the workplace or from the union, if there is one, can participate in the creation of the plan, how the employer can request an evaluation by an outside medical or other expert at the employer's expense to assist the employer in determining if accommodation can be achieved, and if so, how it can be achieved. The steps taken to protect the confidentiality of the employee's personal information. How and when the plan will be completed. How frequently the plan will be reviewed and updated, and how it will be executed. An explanation of why the individual accommodation plan was denied, if applicable. The plan must also be provided in a format that considers the employee's accessibility needs. Lastly, employers need to ensure the safety of employees with disabilities, temporary or permanent, by providing them with individualized emergency response information when necessary. While there are only a few guidelines that outline what a workplace personalized emergency response plan must include, there are some best practices that all businesses should follow when creating one. Employers should work alongside the affected worker to create the personalized workplace emergency plan. Employers must also seek out volunteers to help the worker in the event of an emergency. The Workplace Personalized Information Response Plan should include the name of the worker with a disability, the worker's department. Also include specific information about the workplace, such as the floor, office number, or desk location of the worker. Detailed employee information will assist the volunteer by providing specific details of the worker. In case of an emergency, it's best to have a worker's personal emergency contact information. Emergency contact information should include name, phone number, email, relationship to the worker. List any assistance workers with disabilities need, such as whether the worker needs assistance or a volunteer to help get out of the building or work area, how to move workers who have mobility impairments. Also include detailed information regarding equipment and devices the worker uses, such as what kind of device or devices a worker uses, for example, a walker, wheelchair, cane, crutches, or service animal. The location of the equipment or devices, if it is stored, how to use the equipment or devices. Emergency alerts and signage. Buildings should have multiple signals such as audio, visual, and vibratory alarms. There are many devices on the market that emit both audio and visual cues in the event of an emergency. Individuals with disabilities must be made aware of these cues if an emergency arises. Include and describe the emergency alerts your business has and how the employee will be notified. Despite having both audio and visual alerts, volunteers should still notify the employee in an emergency. For example, if a worker has a hearing impairment, they will require a visual alarm system and a co-worker to notify them. Visual signage needs to be legible for anyone to read. Signage should contain images, braille, and large print to help guide workers. Another way you can strengthen your plan is by offering audio instruction via public address system or PA system. These directions must be clear enough to lead individuals with disabilities unassisted to a general exit route, where they can seek assistance and safely exit the building. The exit strategy must be safe for everyone to use. If stairs are the only option for exiting the building, the employer should offer backup aids such as a stair descent device. Elevators should not be considered as an option to use in an emergency exit strategy. Exit paths should be clear of any obstructions on the floor and overhead. All doors should be labeled accordingly. For example, workers with visual impairment would need braille on signage to direct them. If a worker is immobilized or uses equipment or an assistive device, a volunteer must be contacted to assist the worker. Employers should offer a physical aid, such as an evacuation chair, in order to transport the individual to safety. Workers with disabilities and volunteers must be trained on the emergency plan. The volunteer or volunteers will need to know how to provide assistance and how to offer physical support properly. All employers, except for small private and non-profit organizations, must have a return-to-work process in place for employees who have been absent from work due to a disability and require disability-related accommodations in order to return to work. However, if an employee's injury or illness is covered by the return-to-work provision under any law, the return-to-work process under AODA does not apply. The return-to-work process must be in writing and include the steps taken by the employer to transition the employee back to work, the individual accommodation plan. In this module, you learned the requirements for recruiting, hiring, and career development for workers with disabilities. You learned what you need to include in an individual accommodation plan and a workplace personalized emergency response plan. You also learned the requirements for the return to work process. Module 4. Transportation Standards. This module covers the transportation standards. By the end of this module, you will be able to identify the general responsibilities conventional and specialized transportation providers must follow. The accessibility standard for transportation applies to both conventional and specialized transportation service companies. These companies must notify the public of any information about accessibility equipment and features of their vehicles, routes, and services. They must provide this information in accessible formats upon request. Companies must train workers and volunteers on how to use accessible equipment and features safely. Training must also include what to do if accessible equipment or features stop working, or if there are accessibility barriers, such as construction. In addition, workers and volunteers must be trained to make sure people with disabilities are safe during emergencies, and emergency response plans must be accessible to the public. When accessible equipment is not working, service companies must find other ways to accommodate people who use this equipment. They must also ensure that the equipment is fixed as soon as possible. Conventional and specialized transportation companies should provide transportation to the support person accompanying a disabled person free of charge. Additionally, they must not charge more than the usual fares. Conventional transportation includes buses, streetcars, subways, trains, ferries. Conventional transportation service providers shall, upon request of a person with a disability, deploy lifting devices, ramps, or portable bridge plates. Ensure the person with a disability has enough time to board, be secured, and deboard. Assist with storing mobility aids and assistive devices. Allow a person with a disability to travel with a medical aid. If a bus, motor coach, or streetcar stop is not accessible, passengers must be able to board or deboard at the nearest safe accessible location along the vehicle's route. Drivers must report inaccessible stops and temporary barriers. Conventional transportation service companies must provide designated and marked priority seats or areas for people with disabilities, located as near as possible to vehicle entrances. Signs should alert passengers without disabilities that they must vacate the seats if passengers with disabilities need to use them. Service providers must also provide visual and verbal announcements of routes and stops on their vehicles. Lastly, they must fulfill the AODA technical requirements for special features, such as lifting devices, steps, grab bars and/or handrails, floor surfaces, lighting, signage, stop requests, and emergency response controls. If a conventional transportation company's services will be disrupted along a certain route and the company knows about the disruption in advance, it must ensure there is an accessible way to transport passengers with disabilities. The company must provide this information to passengers in formats they can access. Assistive devices should be stored in passenger compartments where their owners can reach them whenever it is safe to do so. Otherwise, they must be placed in storage compartments and returned to their owners as soon as possible. Conventional transportation service providers cannot charge a fee for the storage of mobility aids or assistive devices, such as wheelchairs or walkers. If people cannot use certain payment options because of their disabilities, other payment options should be available. Specialized transportation service companies must create an eligibility application process, including an independent appeal process. Information about the application and appeal process must be made available in accessible formats upon request. If a company operates both conventional and specialized transportation, it is required by law to charge fares that are less or equal to that of the conventional transportation, provide the same fare structure and payment options, and additional payment options if the passengers need to use them. Provide the same hours and days of service as those offered by conventional transportation. If conventional and specialized transportation are offered by different companies in the same location, the specialized transportation company may charge no more than the highest cost of conventional transportation. If specialized transportation companies require advanced booking, they must allow passengers to book on the day of travel whenever possible, or up to 3 hours before the end of the company's hours of operation on the day before the day of travel. Passengers must be able to book trips in accessible ways. Companions may travel with passengers if there is space. Dependent children may also travel with a parent who uses the service. If there are service delays half an hour or more after a scheduled pickup time, companies must inform passengers about the length of the delays. Taxi owners and drivers are not allowed to charge a person with a disability a higher price than they would charge a person without a disability for the same trip. They are also not allowed to charge extra fees for storing a person's mobility aid, such as a wheelchair or walker. Public school boards that provide transportation services for students must provide integrated, accessible school transportation services when possible. When that is not possible, or it is not the best option for a student because of the nature of their disability or safety concerns, then the school board must provide appropriate alternative accessible transportation services. School boards, in consultation with parents or guardians of students with disabilities, shall develop individual school transportation plans for each student with a disability. This includes details of the needs of the student with a disability and plans for boarding, securement, and deboarding. As well, school boards must identify and communicate the roles and responsibilities of the transportation provider, the parents or guardians of the student with a disability, the student, the operator of the vehicle, and the appropriate school staff. In this module, you learned some of the general responsibilities that both conventional and specialized transportation providers must follow, such as transit stops, storage, bookings, and service delays. Module 5. Design of Public Spaces Standards. This module covers the design of public spaces standards. The design of public spaces covers two general areas, namely public spaces and buildings. By the end of this module, you will be able to identify the kinds of public spaces that must be made accessible. The accessibility standard for the design of public spaces applies only to new construction and major alterations to existing structural features. It covers recreational trails and beach access routes, outdoor public eating areas like rest stops or picnic areas, outdoor play spaces like playgrounds in provincial parks and local communities, outdoor paths of travel like sidewalks, ramps, stairs, curb ramps, rest areas, and accessible pedestrian signals, accessible parking on and off-street, service-related elements like service counters, fixed queuing lines and waiting areas, and maintenance and restoration of public spaces. Organizations building or renovating recreational trails or beach access routes must consult with the public and persons with disabilities before building about the need for, location, and design of trail amenities, rest areas, passing areas, viewing areas, other pertinent features. Any change in the level of a trail or beach access route must have a slope or ramp. All ramps must comply with the technical requirements for ramps found in the Design of Public Spaces standards. Outdoor public eating areas include picnic grounds and outdoor tables in parks, hospitals, and universities. Larger organizations must make at least 20% of their tables accessible. Accessible tables must have knee and toe clearance, a level and firm surface leading to and under the table, clear ground space allowing for a forward approach. Outdoor public play areas like playgrounds must incorporate accessibility features such as sensory and active play components for children and caregivers with various disabilities into their design. Large and public sector organizations building or renovating play spaces must consult the public and persons with disabilities about what their needs are. Municipalities must also consult their municipal accessibility advisory committees. Outdoor public play areas like playgrounds must incorporate accessibility features such as sensory and active play components for children and caregivers with various disabilities into their design. Large and public sector organizations building or renovating play spaces must consult the public and persons with disabilities about what their needs are. Municipalities must also consult their municipal accessibility advisory committees. Outdoor play spaces must include a firm and stable ground surface built to prevent injury on impact, clearance for children and caregivers of all abilities to move to, through, and around the space. Outdoor paths of travel. Walkways and sidewalks must meet general technical requirements for exterior paths of travel. Some of these requirements include minimum width and height clearance, as well as a firm, stable, and slip-resistant surface. Any change in the level of a walkway or sidewalk must have a slope or ramp. All ramps must comply with the technical requirements for ramps found in the Design of Public Spaces standards of the IASR. When outdoor paths of travel include stairs, curb ramps, depressed curbs, or accessible pedestrian control signals, these elements of the path must be built to comply with the technical requirements for them listed in the Design of Public Spaces standards. When developing on-street parking spaces, designated public sector organizations must consult with the public and persons with disabilities about the need, location, and design of accessible spaces. Municipalities must also consult with their municipal accessibility advisory committees. Off-street parking spaces are of two types. Type A has a wider parking space and has signage that identifies the space as van accessible, and Type B has a standard parking space. The number of accessible parking space facilities should have varies according to the number and types of all their parking spaces. Parking spaces for persons with disabilities in off-street parking facilities must include access aisles or space between parking spaces so that people have enough room to enter and exit their vehicles. When constructing service-related elements such as service counters, fixed queuing guides, and waiting areas, certain general requirements must be met, such as a minimum of one publicly accessible counter for each type of service provided. Queuing lines must be wide enough for persons with mobility aids to use and have cane-detectable guides. A minimum of 3% of total new seats in waiting areas must be accessible. Public spaces with accessibility-related equipment and features must be safe to use. You can ensure this by conducting preventative and emergency maintenance measures whenever necessary, and by developing procedures so that persons with disabilities can access services when accessibility features are temporarily unavailable. In this module, you learn some of the requirements for updated or newly constructed spaces and buildings, such as the general requirements for recreational trails and beach access routes, outdoor play spaces, and accessible parking. Module 6. Customer Service Standards. After completing this module, you will be able to explain the purpose of the AODA's Customer Service Standards, explain the requirements for providing accessible customer service through communication, service animals, support persons, training, and feedback. The purpose of the Customer Service Standards is for service providers to recognize and understand the needs of persons with disabilities and meet them accordingly. In addition to general training requirements, all employees and volunteers must be trained on how to interact and communicate with people who have various types of disabilities, including people who use an assistive device or have a service animal or support person. Use equipment or devices provided by the service provider that may assist a person with a disability. Handle a situation where a person with a disability is having difficulty accessing a provider's goods, services, or facilities. The next few slides discuss ways of communicating with customers who have different disabilities, providing for assistive devices and accessible services, support persons and service animals, and getting feedback from customers. Always look at and speak directly to a customer with a disability instead of to a friend or support person. If you think a customer might need help, ask. The customer will explain what kind of help, if any, is needed. In addition to using a wheelchair, anyone who uses an assistive device such as crutches, a cane, or a walker is considered to have a physical disability. On the other hand, a person with a physical disability may not have an assistive device. Sometimes people have conditions that affect their balance and/or mobility, for example, the distance they are able to walk or the amount of time they can spend standing. So it is vital to consider all forms of physical disabilities when trying to make your workplace accessible. The following list offers some ideas on how to provide accessible customer service for people with physical disabilities. Ensure your building, office, or store has accessible parking, automatic doors, wide and clear pathways, accessible washrooms, seating, ramps in replacement or in addition to steps, products shelved at a reasonable height, handrails, signage at various heights. Below are situational examples and suggestions on what you can do. If you feel that you will need to have a lengthy conversation with a customer using a wheelchair or crutches, consider finding a place to sit in order to make eye contact easily. When you need to clear a crowded area or pass in front of a customer using a wheelchair or crutches, refrain from touching their equipment such as canes or wheelchairs without permission. If given permission to move a customer's wheelchair, do not position the customer in an awkward spot or undignified place such as in front of entrance or exit doors or facing the wall. Let customers know about features such as elevators, automatic doors, and other accessible features in your building. A visual disability can make it difficult for someone to read, locate landmarks, or see hazards, such as boxes on the floor. Not everyone who has a visual disability is completely blind. Many people have low vision. Do not assume you know how much someone can see. Some customers may use a white cane or guiding dog to navigate their surroundings. Others may ask that you act as a sighted guide and will take your arm as you lead them. Ensure your building, office, or store has large print and/or braille signage and buttons, other accessible materials such as menus, business cards, and forms, a clear path free of any items that may be physical obstacles such as boxes or ladders, workers trained to offer appropriate assistance if requested or needed, and merchandise at eye level. Below are situational examples and suggestions on what you can do. When you see that a customer has a cane or guide dog and touches things to identify them, don't assume that the person can't see you. Some people may have severely compromised vision but can still see. So when you first approach the customer, identify yourself and ask how you may be of assistance. The customer may hear you approach, but be unable to see that you wear a uniform or name tag identifying you as an employee. During interactions, establish eye contact and speak directly to the customer instead of expecting someone else, such as a friend, to be a go-between. When giving directions or instructions, be precise and descriptive. Give specific directions, such as 2 steps to the left. Do not point or say, over there. Ask if the customer wants you to read instructions or descriptions out loud, or let the customer know if you have any braille, large print, or online material that the customer may be able to read independently. If you need to leave an area, tell the customer you are doing so before you go. Persons with hearing loss may be totally deaf or be hard of hearing. Additionally, they may be oral deaf, which means they can speak and understand speech by observing your facial movement and body language. Other customers may prefer to communicate using a pen and paper, or may use sign language if an interpreter is present. Some have hearing aids, while some do not. Ensure your building, office, or store has detailed signage, a phone system that supports communication between hearing people and people who are deaf or hard of hearing, a method of booking appointments online or through text messaging, closed captioning on any television, or captions provided for any promotional videos. Below are situational examples and suggestions on what you can do. You can help customers who speech read lips and faces, by moving to a well-lit area to ensure that your face and mouth are easy to see and read. Sometimes you may need to attract the customer's attention before speaking. You can do this by lightly touching the customer's shoulder or waving your hand. If needed, ask if the customer might prefer another mode of communication. For example, the customer might prefer to have things written down or drawn on paper. If the customer communicates through a sign language interpreter, speak directly to the customer, not the interpreter. Customers may have impaired speech because they stutter or have a voice disorder. Others have severely impaired speech and communicate using communication boards or other assistive devices. Below are situational examples and suggestions on what you can do. Don't assume that a customer with a speech or language difficulty also has another disability. Keep the interaction simple. Ask questions that can be answered with a yes or no. Be patient. Don't interrupt or finish your customer's sentences. If you are unsure what a customer has said, repeat what you think the customer has said and ask if this is correct instead of trying to guess. An invisible disability can be a cognitive, developmental, intellectual, mental, or sensory condition that limits a person's behaviors, senses, or activities. You may not be aware that customers have these disabilities unless they tell you. As with all disabilities, don't make assumptions about what people's abilities are. If customers appear to need help, ask them how you can help. There are too many invisible disabilities to name them all, but some invisible disabilities include attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, arthritis, brain injuries, chronic fatigue, gastrointestinal disease, epilepsy, chronic pain, learning disabilities, mental illness, multiple sclerosis, or MS. Below are situational examples and suggestions on what you can do. Treat all customers with the same level of respect and consideration. Remain calm and reassure customers who seem anxious. Consider moving to a location with fewer distractions, such as loud noises, crowds, or interruptions. Work with customers to meet their individual needs. For example, acknowledge that you have heard and understood what the customer has said. Respect customers' personal space. Respond to the way a customer is behaving at a given time. If a customer is behaving inappropriately, connect actions to consequences as you would with other customers. For example, if you scream, I won't be able to talk to you. Speak normally, but use plain language. Give one piece of information at a time. If you are unsure whether you understand what a customer has said, repeat or summarize the information and ask if this is correct instead of trying to guess. Ask if a customer would like help reading information or filling out forms. And be patient. Give customers more time to respond. Sometimes accessibility features or services are temporarily unavailable. They may require repair or maintenance services. When this happens, let your customers know by posting a notice. For example, if an accessible elevator is temporarily being serviced, you may want to post an out-of-order sign on the door or wall near it to let the public know. Here's what else you can do. Prepare a template notice ahead of time. Include the reason for the disruption, how long the service will be unavailable, and alternate facilities or services, if any. Post these notices in places that are most visible to the public. For example, the entrance door to your business, on your website, another high-traffic area. Make sure notices are posted in several ways so that customers with various disabilities can access them. Service animals are used by people with many different kinds of disabilities. Examples of service animals include guide dogs used by people who are blind or have low vision, hearing alert animals for people who are deaf, and animals trained to alert an individual to an oncoming seizure and lead them to safety. A service animal is specially trained to assist an individual with disabilities. It may be visibly apparent to onlookers that the animal is used for reasons relating to a person's disability. There are several ways of identifying a service animal, such as service animals may wear a harness or vest identifying what kinds of service they provide. Handlers may have an identification card detailing the kind of disability the animal assists with. If it is not readily apparent that the animal is a service animal, then the Ontario regulation states that a letter may be requested from a physician or nurse practitioner confirming that the person requires the animal for reasons relating to a disability. Under no circumstances is the service provider allowed to ask about the nature of the disability. Service animals must be welcomed into all areas where the public is allowed. If a customer who uses a service animal wishes to access a location that the public can enter but where service animals are not legally permitted, service providers must offer alternative accommodations for the person with a disability to obtain, use, and benefit from the provider's goods or services. Here are some suggestions for how to do so. You can decide to have your transactions take place in a separate area. You may provide a secure area to leave the animal if the customer is comfortable doing so. In the latter case, you will have to provide support for the person who requires assistance. Here are a few tips for interacting with a customer with a service animal. Pay attention to the owner, not the service animal. Do not touch the animal without asking permission first. Only the handler should feed the service animal unless given permission. Be sensitive and respectful. Don't ask the customer about their disability. Do not request that the animal be left in a different location. A support person is someone who accompanies a person with a disability to help with communication, mobility, personal care or medical needs, or with access to goods, services, or facilities. To comply with the customer service standard, organizations must welcome support persons and ensure that customers with disabilities are not prevented from having access to their support persons while on the premises. Providers may only require that a support person be present if they have consulted with a customer and they determine that a support person is necessary to protect the health or safety of the person with a disability or others. There is no other reasonable way to protect the health or safety of the person with a disability or others. They will not charge support persons if the organization requires a support person to accompany a customer with a disability on their premises. Organizations must provide an easy way for customers to give feedback on accessibility. Service providers must have a process in place for receiving and responding to feedback about how the organization provides goods, services, and facilities to customers with disabilities. Customers must be able to offer feedback using accessible formats and communication supports if needed. For example, a company's website may include a feedback form, a telephone number, or text telephone, TTY, or email address. Also, the feedback process must be available to the public, for example, on an organization's website on their accessibility page. In this module, you learned about the customer service standards under the AODA. You learned that the purpose of this standard is to recognize the needs of customers with disabilities and meet those needs. You learned about various ways to provide accessible customer service, notably communication, welcoming service animals and support persons, training employees and volunteers, and making it easy for customers to provide feedback on accessibility. In this course, you learned about your rights and responsibilities under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. You learned the benefits of creating an inclusive workplace and an accessible Ontario. You learned about the 5 standards under the IASR: information and communication, employment, transportation, design of public spaces, and customer service.